So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Tessie Rose Bailey. She is a principal consultant on the National Center on Intensive Intervention at AIR and has many, many years of experience providing support related to response to intervention and multi-tiered systems of support to states and districts. Dr. Bailey is also the director of the Center on MTSS that is at AIR, and she is also the director of a new OSEP-funded center, the Progress Center, the purpose of which is to promote progress for students with disabilities. She's going to speak a little bit more about work related to the Progress Center, the Center on MTSS, and NCII throughout this entire presentation. So welcome, Dr. Bailey, and we're glad to have you.
All right, thanks, Lindsay, and thanks, Sarah. I'm excited to be here. I'm actually based out in Salt Lake City, so I'm not too far away. As Lindsay mentioned, I am currently working with the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and today I'm going to share some of our lessons learned with virtual intervention and progress monitoring from the springtime, but also just based on years of experience in working in this particular environment. I actually have my own kids who have been in virtual schooling for several years, and myself was a virtual school teacher at the university level and at the local level. I do want to just briefly talk quickly about the MTSS Center. That center will be launching in mid-August. It is at AIR. If you're familiar with the National Center on Response to Intervention, this is evolution. As we've learned from the research and have really started to understand what's necessary for implementation, the MTSS Center has emerged. There will be some resources that will also be posted there for virtual implementation of MTSS. And then finally, the Progress Center. As Lindsay mentioned, it is our new OSEP-funded center. We focus primarily on ensuring that students with disabilities have access to high-quality educational programming. And we are focused on ensuring that there's access to virtual special education, intervention, and progress monitoring. So stay tuned to that center as well. You can find us at promotingprogress.org. Before I get started, just sharing some of the resources, I do want to share what we know about virtual instruction. Many of you do or are aware that there are some schools that do primarily virtual intervention and virtual schooling. And so we've had several decades to really understand what does it take to develop and design high quality programming that can be delivered through the virtual setting. One of the things that we've definitely learned is that teachers need to be trained and provided the time for planning in a remote learning environment. It's not a direct switch. We don't just take what we did in a face-to-face and move it to a virtual setting. There are some strategies that we know that are necessary for increased engagement. We do know that delivering intervention and instruction in a virtual setting for the participants can be a little bit more cognitively tasking. So we have to really rethink the way that we design our instruction and how we actually deliver that intervention or assessment tools. We also know that in virtual settings that the majority of students receive their instruction in a virtual environment, and in those cases, parents are typically involved with those students. So as you move into the school year, we often sort of think about ourselves as the sole deliverer of that information. But in a virtual setting, we really depend on the collaborative engagement of families to ensure that students get adequate opportunities for practice and feedback. If you think about a face-to-face environment, while you are delivering some of those opportunities for practice and feedback, you also have peers who are doing some of that delivery and feedback. And we don't really have that in a virtual setting, even if we have small groups that are there. We can put students in small groups for feedback, but they don't often get that immediate feedback, whether it's an app or a touch or even a look sometimes. So you want to make sure that the lessons have an element of parental involvement to the extent that's practicable. We also know that when we think about interventions and instructional delivery in a virtual setting, that only a small proportion is really spent on the computer. I think we, from a face-to-face standpoint, want to translate our 30-minute intervention face-to-face to a 30-minute Zoom session. And that may not really be the most feasible or effective for the student. So we want to think about how can we maximize our technology without ensuring or without requiring that the student is consistently sitting on that Zoom call the whole time. Because if they're sitting and paying attention to you, then they're often not engaged in the material or the actual work you're trying to get. We know that in virtual intervention and virtual instruction, what we find to be the most effective is actually when students are engaged in the materials and are away from the actual virtual Zoom environment or some sort of computer-based program. So I'm going to share with you some strategies today about the asynchronous, synchronous intervention delivery to really maximize your opportunities for practice for the student and ensure that you're getting the data that you need. Just know that there is always this balance of asynchronous and synchronous, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is, but the asynchronous is things that we do that are not in real time, and synchronous are things that we do in real time. And as you probably know, most people who select intervention in a virtual setting outside of COVID have done it because the families feel that it's the right option. You're going to probably find some folks who don't necessarily think that this is the preferred option. So we want to make sure that we're engaging with families about what's the best approach in this particular environment. While one approach works for one student, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for another. And a lot of the interventions that we're using have not necessarily been validated in a remote setting. So we're kind of doing a little bit of trial and error. There are a lot of computer-based programs that can be maximized for virtual delivery, and I'll share what some of those are, and I'll share how the NCII website through its tools chart can help you really find tools that would be feasible in that virtual environment. What's nice about it is a lot of those tools do have built-in assessment for diagnostic or progress monitoring that can really help you do a sort of double duty, as opposed to delivering your intervention in one Zoom setting or in another sort of virtual setting, and then trying to collect the data in a different setting. Something else to think about, and this really comes from the Progress Center sort of lens, although with NCII we also work primarily with students with disabilities, is when we think about the delivery or the design of our intervention and our IEPs, is they are written or developed for the virtual learning in mind. And as we're transitioning to this sort of either hybrid, virtual, or face-to-face or fully virtual, we have to remember that a lot of the strategies and tools that we're using have not necessarily been validated in that environment, but have been validated as an approach. For example, explicit instruction. We know that that's a validated practice, but we haven't necessarily validated in the exact way that you might be doing it with your student. That's why monitoring can be very valuable, because it gives you the immediate feedback about whether what you're doing is working or not working. I'm going to share some tools on our website, and I just want to share that they can be used in both a synchronous and asynchronous environment or delivery method. We are probably most used to synchronous, unless you were thrown in to some of that in the spring. But synchronous is really what we're doing in real time, right? Where we stand in front of the group or we sit at the table with our small group of kids. It allows us to actually be a little more flexible, and in some cases be a little bit more on the fly, right? And we know that from a delivery standpoint, when we're having to do virtual settings, using this synchronous instruction is best used when we're teaching new skills, right? So I want to introduce a new concept, or I have a student who's working on a skill but not yet mastered it. These are the places in which synchronous instruction would be the most effective. Asynchronous is also very effective when it's used in the right way. When we look at a lot of our virtual schooling options or some of the virtual interventions that have existed for about a decade, what we find is a lot of the intervention is done in an asynchronous way, where the teacher actually delivers something in a synchronous fashion, gets the kids set up, ensures that they understand what they're doing, but then there's a lot of practice opportunities either independently or perhaps with a family member or another peer virtually, in which they're sort of engaged in these asynchronous activities without the teacher. They're great for practicing the skills that have been taught, right? And we sometimes forget about this in our intervention, is we're so focused on making sure the student is getting the explicit instruction and what the skill is and being able to show that skill, that we often don't have enough time within our interventions for the student to practice and receive feedback. So these are things that we would often see in a general education instruction where we're looking at attention to transfer. But in a virtual environment, unless you're explicitly collaborating with the general ed teacher, the student may not get those skills reinforced. So we want to make sure that the family members are sort of reinforcing those skills over the course of the day and the course of the week. Now, when we think about explicit instruction, we do know that in an intervention standpoint, we do get the biggest bang for our buck. And so I just want to help you think about what's the best use of your explicit instruction approach in terms of synchronous or asynchronous. When we think about the actual modeling and guided practice, this is where you can really focus your synchronous instruction. And if you have a lot of students or you maybe have a student who needs more practice, don't feel obligated to provide that 30-minute section at 9 to 9:30. You could perhaps do a synchronous modeling session from 9 to 9:10 with some guided practice, put the kids with their peers in their virtual setting in a small group to practice, come back, so that you feel comfortable that the student has mastered the skill necessary for independent practice. And it's that independent practice that we can start to think about from an intervention standpoint, doing that asynchronously. And that way, as a teacher, we're not always on the camera, right? And we know from kids, we don't want them always on the camera. So we want to maximize the time that we have the kids sitting with us. I'm going to share some of the resources with that frame in mind that you can use to deliver your virtual interventions and think about progress monitoring. I will just start out by saying nothing is perfect. There's a lot of lessons learned. We have been working with about 56 teachers across the country who have been sharing their lessons learned in virtual intervention delivery and progress monitoring. We do not currently have those on the website, but we will be posting those. But really about how do we adapt, let's say, a face-to-face math instruction for virtual delivery when we don't have manipulatives? Or what about if we're trying to teach a more complex construct for science and the kid is really struggling with how to sort of break it apart to really understand it? Or how do we screen our progress monitoring virtually? So we've had teachers who've been doing that and documenting their efforts, and then we'll be sharing with you those with you over the next month or so. But I want to share what we currently have. And if you get a chance, I highly recommend right now you can go to our intensiveintervention.org. On our website, you will see that there is across the front, there is the Faculty Professional Learning Series. And Lindsay's going to talk about this towards the end, but it's really about building the capacity of your faculty and your service providers to ensure that folks have some of the information that I'm going to share today, but actually goes a lot deeper. I'm also going to share some sample lessons that we've put together for virtual delivery and how you can use our intervention materials based on the website so that you can easily move in to that sort of adaptations. And then I'm going to talk about some of the frequently asked questions around progress monitoring. We do get a lot of questions. We recently had a webinar through the Progress Center and the MTSS Center within CSI around virtual screening and data collection, but we've also been working with publishers over the last month to really understand what's necessary for virtual progress monitoring. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. And I don't know if there's anything in the chat box that's a for sure I need to address. Otherwise, I'll just move right in to sharing some of the things that we already have in place. So if you are not familiar with selecting and using intensive intervention, designing intensive intervention in your just face-to-face session, then this would be a great place to start. And I highly recommend checking out our intensive intervention. There's some self-paced modules that can help walk you through everything. But what I would like to show you right now is really where we look at our intervention materials, and then I'll move to the assessment. our goal is to really ensure that educators have the capacity to intensify instruction. And we look at intensification based on a validated intervention platform. So we're assuming that you're selecting or designing an intervention that is likely to produce results for the student, but needs to be intensified for a particular kid. Under our intervention materials, you'll see that we have it broken down by literacy, math, and behavior, which are probably a lot of the intervention areas that you would be addressing. You click on under intervention materials and literacy, you'll get to some of our first set of resources. Prior to COVID, what we ended up having is a series of intensification lesson plans. These are things that can be embedded throughout your day, aligned with an existing intervention, or help you build an intervention for students. They are divided by the 5 big ideas of reading, and each of those has a lesson plan that includes all of the materials that are necessary for the delivery. The nice thing about these lesson plans, based on what I talked about earlier, is they're short and explicit. We know that in a virtual setting, trying to maintain attention can be quite difficult, and we know that students get what we call Zoom fatigue. So these interventions are really designed to be 5 to 10 minutes max, and they're fairly scripted. So if you're new to the intervention, it will help you sort of understand how do you structure the lesson, how do you set up your groups for the students, and how do you actually move through the lesson to ensure that you're eliciting feedback from students and providing explicit feedback. In these lessons, you'll see the bold is the script. So if you're using your paraeducators, it's also a really great resource. It does tell you what's the intervention principle for the explicit instruction, which I mentioned earlier. But as you move through, what you'll see is there's some error correction feedback, and that way we're very explicit. We don't have a lot of time on a Zoom call, so we want to make sure that we are maximizing our time to provide the most explicit, correct feedback for the student in the time that we have them. There's also some instructional considerations to think about how you might adapt it for various environments, and I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. And if there are any materials that are needed for the delivery of this particular intervention, you'll find them in the actual lesson plan. So it's kind of like a go-to, everything's there. They are used for kindergarten all the way up through middle school. There are not high school ones because we focus on the big ideas and the basic skills. But they could be adapted for students who are older who have some of these skill deficits. Right here, what you'll see is some guidance on how to implement, and these are the things that I'd like to point out for you today, is we've taken and modeled what these lesson plans are for use in a virtual setting. So you'll see at the bottom that we've done it for both reading and math. We haven't modeled every single lesson, but we've modeled the principles of adapting these types of face-to-face lesson plans to a virtual setting. There are 2 types of videos and tips. The first ones are for parents, or for educators, and the second ones are for parents. And as I mentioned, in order for us to really maximize benefit of a virtual learning environment, we have to somehow engage family members in ensuring that students get sufficient practice opportunities and feedback throughout the day. So these video tips for parents are to really show them how they would maximize their feedback, right? We also want them to be explicit. There are some examples for parents. So if you're engaging with the parent and you're using a lesson plan and you would like a parent to do a quick 3-minute or 5-minute update with their child, this is a great way to do it. And when we've worked with parents, they've said it helps them feel more empowered to support their student. We have alongside of this some guidance from Amazon Prime, like you can ask Amazon through your Alexa, like how best to provide feedback designed for parents. But that will help them be able to sort of reinforce the learning that you're doing in your synchronous sessions. This is a mother, it's actually me with my son doing a reading lesson, but also a grandfather who was able to sort of pick the materials up fairly quickly and adapt them. There were very short lessons, 2 to 3 minutes. So it's really meant to just provide additional practice opportunities distributed across the day or the week, as opposed to a single mass practice for a child. At the bottom, there's also you as an educator to share with parents some tips about how to use these resources, how to actually provide feedback, how to first, sort of what should you focus on. So feel free to check those out when you're engaging in your collaborative conversations with your parents about how best to maximize virtual intervention learning. I want to share what's the resources for educators, because they're very similar. But what it does is it talks about how do we actually deliver this in a synchronous session in a, let's say, Zoom, GoToMeeting, Google Hangout, or whatever you're doing. And it demonstrates how you can actually take the resources that are on there and adapt them for virtual delivery. Because they focus on evidence-based practices that are applicable in multiple settings, the translation from face-to-face to virtual is pretty seamless in most cases. Really where we see the sort of differences is the type of manipulatives or materials. And so there are recommendations here in the tip sheets about how best to do that. Our teacher examples will also be sharing how they've made manipulatives, and we'll be sharing those too for math intervention delivery, as well as reading intervention delivery, or adapting some of the behavioral tools that we have. If you feel like you need more information about how to actually design your own intervention because you're lacking, let's say, a validated platform, or feeling like you've been very dependent on a purchase tool that is no longer accessible to your students, I do recommend checking out our course content. And in the course content, what we have, you'll see that under implementation support, is can walk you through how to design and implement math interventions, which can be delivered either in virtual or face-to-face for math, behavior, as well as reading intervention. The last thing I want to just share is around progress monitoring. It's probably one of those things that we get the most questions about. And as I mentioned, we did do a webinar. The easiest way to access these resources is from, the main page. What we have done is work with publishers who are based on our progress monitoring tools chart, so the leading publishers around the country, about how their tools can be adapted or delivered within a virtual setting. In this sheet, what we do have are resources for helping you take your particular tool. So you can see, how does my tool be used virtually? A lot of you are already using tools, so this will probably be your first go-to. But you'll find that each of those that have published or are promoting a particular progress monitoring tool have guidance for how it can be adapted, or even if it can be adapted for a virtual setting. Some things I want to point out, though, from a lessons learned standpoint, is if you're only monitoring progress from a compliance standpoint or from a paperwork standpoint, I would ask you to sort of step back with your team and reflect on this first question, is really the so what? Why are we progress monitoring? The whole purpose of progress monitoring in a virtual setting is, for one, to see if the new intervention delivery is valid for the student. Is it working? It could have been that the same intervention that you did in the spring in a face-to-face led to a lot of progress, but when it was adapted to a virtual environment, you don't get the same impact. And it could be a couple of different things. It could be the format of your delivery, but it could also be some other impact that's happening from COVID stress, social emotional impacts, or even attention that's coming from the distractions that occur at home. And I'll share, before I move off, just a last resource about some questions for you to think about when you look at that progress monitoring data and you're trying to figure out, wow, why is the student progressing? How can I replicate that for other kids? Or why is the student not progressing, and what do I need to do differently to ensure that this student can be successful? Some other questions I just want you to be aware of, and just know that you can close any of these. is there are some concerns about the validity of your progress monitoring data. Maybe the norms and the rates of improvement may not be validated for a virtual delivery. But what we want to encourage you is to at least understand the limitations and strengths of your tool as you go to interpret it. Nothing is going to be perfect because no one was really planning for this. So we have to just understand what is the validity of our data, how can it help us to make better decisions about instruction, and how can it help us really monitor whether this student is responding or not, so that we can make decisions about, is this a kid who might have a disability and maybe needs special education, or a student who may need to move to a less intensive year. So one tool I just want to share, and this will be in the implementation supports under data teams. It's the, we have been doing a lot of work around virtual teaming options. We work with the state of Wyoming, who, because of the rural nature of the schools and the limited teachers that are in a school, have been doing a lot of virtual teaming in the springtime to problem solve around particular students. And this is something I'd recommend checking out as well. In this resource, what we have are resources for how to set up your meeting, how to facilitate it, and how do participants, including parents, if you're including them in your teaming meetings, participate in this particular activity. Two tools I want to point out, there's a lot on here, but two tools that might be of the most interest to you are our intensification strategy checklist. So if you're thinking about this virtual intervention delivery, you've looked at your data, and it's not working for the student, what is it that you can do for intensification? And this is a tool that was developed by teachers, for teachers, for considerations about how do we intensify. And these are things that can be done both in the virtual and the face-to-face setting. Another tool that might be of interest to you, and this is when you're looking at your progress monitoring or even your diagnostic data, and finding that the student is just not responding in a way that you would like them to, despite your well-designed virtual intervention. These are the questions to help your team and you individually think about in terms of what could be intensified through the intensification strategy checklist. So there's a lot of great resources that exist on the website. And I know sometimes when we have a federally funded website, it's not the most easy to navigate, but we've really tried to make it sort of easy and accessible. The virtual progress monitoring, remember, is on our main page. All of our implementation supports for our data teams, and if you want some professional learning, and then our intervention materials where you can get how to deliver in a virtual setting, some guidance, some sample videos, and tools for parents on our intervention materials site. So I'm going to move back, and I see there are some questions, but I want to open this up to Sarah or Lindsay to see if there's anything that we can.
Yeah. Hi, Tessie. So we have a question. A question came in. I have lots of parents that would be more than willing to engage in the intervention and reinforce at home. And I have a lot of parents that just don't have the time or just won't do it. So how can we support the needs so that students aren't continuing to fall through the cracks?
Yeah, and I think this is a great question. I think there's an assumption that in the spring, for example, people were like, oh my gosh, my parents aren't doing anything. Well, we have to understand that parents have their own demands. Some of them have lost jobs. Some of them have 4 kids at home. So we really have to take the intervention design based on the context. So in those cases in which we have parents who are ready partners, then we want to make sure that we are fully collaborating. But we cannot, I would say, judge or say, well, I tried, but that parent's not going to do it. We instead have to intensify that intervention on our side more, right? So where a parent is more likely to help, I probably don't need as much synchronous instruction as a kid who doesn't have the same parental support. That might be a student who has 3 times as much synchronous instruction, so that they're also getting the feedback and opportunities for practice. And I will say too, I think the communication with parents is really critical. Some parents don't support because they feel inadequate. And I'll give you an example. In the video where we had the grandfather who was working with the son, he was actually somebody who finished high school. He did not have, he didn't feel very comfortable in his own academic skills. He didn't do any college. And at first he said, I can't help him. I'm not a teacher. And the teacher really had to provide the professional development for the parent and the grandparent to help them understand that they did have the skills and that it was not as complex, right? We weren't asking them to do everything, just asking them to do a core set of specific tasks. Great question. So.
Okay, another question that's come in is, how do we justify to parents reducing IEP minutes for virtual learning? How can we ensure parents are supporting the independent practice, and what if they don't, and then the student doesn't make that adequate progress?
Yeah. So I want to just address the second question first, which is, what do I do if parents don't? Parents, in a sense, the IEP is what the district is providing to the parent, and we can't, and this is coming from the Progress Center standpoint, we can't really say to a parent, well, you didn't do your part and that's why your kid didn't make progress. If a parent is unable or unwilling to provide some of that, then we have to compensate in the design of our IEP to ensure that the student is able to progress towards their goals. So it might be, and what we are encouraging is that people to rethink all of their IEPs. While you might have had a student who had a low number of minutes in the spring or pre-COVID is probably a better way to think about it. Post-COVID, this might be a kid who needs much more intensive supports because of the nature of the learning environment that they're at home. So think about what is optimal, collaborate with parents to the extent that's possible, but really understand that the IEP should be able, as designed, provide enough opportunities for, appropriate services, practice opportunities, high quality, specially designed instruction to make progress towards those goals. The first one was about the number of minutes, is that correct?
Yeah, so how do we justify to parents to reduce IEP minutes for virtual learning?
Yeah, I would not do that. I think sometimes we think about the number of minutes as the number of minutes in which the camera is on and I'm sitting here and I'm saying something. Remember, when we think about the design, for example, there are a lot of completely virtual schools that have existed for some time. Some of that special education service can also be asynchronous. You can also include parent training. It's a great way to use some of your special education service funds to really effectively support students. So I wouldn't think about it from a compliance, like how do I reduce minutes, but it's really about how do I write an IEP that's likely to produce results, and then think about the balance of the synchronous and asynchronous delivery that's necessary. And I will just be honest, I have a child with disabilities, and in his face-to-face school, he actually required a lot more support, so there was a lot more distractions, but in the home environment, he needs significantly less. So the data actually supported the reduction of minutes, not necessarily the delivery method.
Tessie, we have questions about considerations for providing intervention in both the secondary setting as well as preschool or early childhood.
Yep. So thinking about it from, and we do a lot more preschool stuff with database individualization out of the NCII and some of our target sites. I will say virtual delivery for small children is quite difficult. It has a lot to do with attention spans, restrictions in terms of kids being on devices and whatnot. To be honest, the best way to deliver early childhood interventions that we've seen is folks who do a hybrid half and half model where parents do bring their child in for a face-to-face to sort of balance out some of the virtual delivery as opposed to all virtual delivery. If that's not an option, that's to really collaborate with families to help support the learning of that student at home, maximizing your paraeducators to provide that distributed access to intervention as opposed to a 130-minute Zoom session with a 4 or 5-year-old. It's just not going to happen. And it could actually be better for you to take that 30 minutes and break it into 6 5-minute check-ins with the kid where they, do something, you do a 2-minute instruction, 2-minute feedback, and then check in with me later. So we have to really think differently about the early childhood attention plan. With secondary, this is where if we are not actively engaging students in the design of the intervention, we're pretty much going to be working against ourselves. And I do recommend with any kid that is in a virtual intervention is to do a check-in. We see this happening in the university settings as well, where folks check in, they look at all sorts of issues that may be impacting the virtual intervention delivery, which is their ability to manage their time, their social emotional, what is the experience? Some kids have not logged on since March 13th. And so we really need to sort of make that connection with older students and talk about what's really feasible in terms of an intervention delivery. We often see the least adherence to asynchronous activities in secondary settings when students feel like what they're being asked to do does not have value. And I think that's where that early conversations between the student and the teacher to really ensure that the intervention is immediately valuable to the student. I don't know if that made it worse or better, but definitely involve the student. It's a parent at the early side and then the student on the secondary side.
Great. Tessie, this is a question from Joey. How would you address teachers who are concerned about the validity of data coming from universal screeners and progress monitoring probes done at home?
Yes. So I would first recommend that you check out the webinar that the National Center on Systemic Improvement did, and I'll post it after this to your Padlet. It was done in collaboration with the Progress Center and the MTSS Center, really around this issue of validity of data. There is no way we're going to have the most accurate data. Even before COVID, we always had concerns about the complete accuracy of data. As long as we are honest about what our data can tell us and that we use multiple data sources to confirm or disconfirm what our data appear to be telling us, then we are doing what's the best thing that we can do at this time. I know that in the spring, a lot of teachers were like, I don't trust my parents. I don't want them to do the progress monitoring data. I will say that there are virtual schools that have existed, have been using things like Renaissance Learning, ISIP, iReady in a virtual setting. And what they do is training for parents, because parents only help their kids because they feel like they're supposed to, right? They're not doing it intentionally. They're not trying to cheat the school or their kids. It's often a lack of understanding about why they can't help their kids, right? That's probably the first time they've seen their kids struggle and they feel bad and they want to help. To be honest, when we initially trained teachers to deliver progress monitoring tools, we saw teachers do the exact same thing. So think about if your parents are delivering those tools at home, make sure that you're providing adequate training for them to understand why they should not be helping and how to submit accurate data. But also when you're teaming, using the data teaming tools I talked about, is really understanding that there is no single data source that's going to be the most accurate. We just want a good picture of where the kid is right now. And then using ongoing progress monitoring data can help us confirm whether those hypotheses about that are accurate. Little long-winded response, so apologize.
Tessie, we have about 2 more minutes. So one more question is, what is your recommendation about using trained volunteers to support families that might not have the time or resources to support that asynchronous instruction?
Yeah, I'm all about the innovative practices. You know, we do a lot of work at the federal level, and what we've thought about is this is one of those things that's going to help us rethink education and how do we better use university students, how are we using community members, because we cannot expect parents to take the brunt of this. I mean, obviously our unemployment is all over the place. So thinking innovatively about how to get parents access to resources, I think is awesome. There's a lot of free people who want to do that. The one thing I would encourage you though is to document your experiences and really evaluate how well it worked, because we can make tweaks to improve the success of it. But if it is working, then even if we move back to face-to-face, that might be something that we want to continue for the benefit of all of our students. All right, well, I want to make sure that we close today. I'm going to pass this over to Lindsay and Sarah to tell you about 2 great additional opportunities, but always follow us on our website. We've got new stuff coming out. You'll find us on Twitter, Facebook, and all sorts of those things. So.
Okay, well, NCII has a faculty professional learning series opportunity. It is obviously targeted toward faculty, but we welcome anyone who is involved in the professional development process for teachers. We have a webinar coming up later this week that's on practice-based opportunities for intensive interventions. So we're going to be talking about ways to structure teacher candidate internships and other practice-based opportunities, as well as a webinar on course content, resources, and continuous program improvement. You need to sign up individually for each of these, and you can do that at intensiveintervention.org. That link to sign up will be the first thing you see at the top of the web page.
The other opportunity that we have is an opportunity just for Colorado educators, and it is called Putting the Special Back in Special Education. We are welcoming Dr. Doug Fuchs to talk a little bit more about the DBI process that Tessie introduced to you and how it can be used to provide specially designed instruction to students with disabilities. That's going to be on September 23rd. I'm sorry, it's from 10 to 11:30 a.m., not p.m. And look for the registration. It'll be coming on the CDE MTSS page, so be on the lookout for that.